Hey guys, this is Lucid, and I'm going to be doing a quick video on army composition and doomstacking. Also, quick update for everybody on the channel. I am away from home and all of my hard drive with all of my recorded stuff on there for Lemuria and for Isphenople. So hang tight. It'll probably be about a week or 2 weeks. Yeah, probably around 2 weeks from now, and I will have all those back uploading again. But for now, I can't really do it. So I'm going to try to put a few things up, maybe 1 or 2 videos a week over the next 2 weeks, just to have kind of some things on there. And one of the topics that was requested was army composition and some thoughts on like doom stacking and things like that. And so I'm kind of just pulling up an old random game. This is my Ulm game, late age Ulm game from way back when. Here I'm deep in the throes of fighting Lemuria, and Utgard was fighting Lemuria, but is also fighting me now too. Anyway, there's a few questions I want to answer in this video, and one of the questions is, how many, when does it make sense to keep all of my units together, and when does it make sense to split them up? And then what are some other, I think at the end we'll cover kind of some rules on army composition when you start kind of putting together a large army. Okay, so when do you want to doomstack? In general, it's a little bit like rock, paper, scissors. If somebody's walking around with a really big army, and you're walking around with a really medium or small army, then the large army is probably going to kill your army, taking almost no casualties. Right? That's kind of how it often works. Not how it always works, but how it often works. So a lot of times you want your big army running around to be able to handle the enemy big army. But the problem is, of course, if you're running around with all your units in one army, and the other guy has an army maybe sort of as big, but he also has some units split up to raid, even if you win the major army conflict, you might not win it so significantly that it's going to make up for the fact that he's been taking 2 or 3 provinces from you a turn for like 4 or 5 turns. So yeah, doomstacking is risky. The other way to look at it is how many units can you support with the amount of mages you are willing to commit. I'll repeat that. How many units can you support in your army, or how many armies can you support given the number of mages you're bringing? Right? Because you may have 500 troops, but you may only have enough mages to make really good use of one army. Right? But if you have a ton of mages, you might be able to very casually split that army into 3 or 4 armies. You follow? And the reason for that, and I'll just pull up this battle, because Abyssia in this case is they're doomstacking around, and you can see they have a little bit of mage support. They have this guy who's probably going to do Fire Fiend, and then they've got, this guy who's probably going to do Firestorm or something, and then he's got some vampires here. I don't know what they're going to do. But this is about the entirety of the Mage Corps. Now, should he split this army in 2 ever? I mean, not really, right? He doesn't have enough mages here to support one army, right? So you can split it. You can, of course, split it to raid, right? Because it doesn't take that many units to kill a small amount of PD. But if they run into something like a thug or something like that, without any mage support, you can easily lose, several hundred gold of units while killing nothing, and they just die to a thug, and that's because they don't have mage support. So a lot of times the number of armies you can field is limited by the amount of mages you're willing to send out of the lab. And that all kind of factors into, what kind of wars you're willing to get into. Because a very, very hard war where your opponent's going to commit a lot of mages, you're probably going to have to commit a lot of your mages too, which is going to slow down your research, it's going to slow down your timings, it could make you more vulnerable to a second war, maybe to somebody else who not only did not lose gold from being in an expensive early war, but they also have had all their mages busy researching instead of running around with armies. So anyway, if we look at the army here, the army report here, we can see there's really only like 4 mages here for this whole big army. And this is a big, high commitment army. I mean, the Fiery Imps don't really count. The Thralls don't really count. But everything else here is a reasonably quality unit. Including these reasonably high resource cost heavy infantry. But of course, there's better units here like the Giants and the Crushers and the Demon Knights anyway. So, the other thing too is it matters the time in the game. Early in the game, you can have unsupported units in armies, and they can run around usually just fine, because really you're not going to worry about like a lot of efficient thugs or magic phase attacks or things like that. But as the game goes later, those things become much more common. Magic phase attacks, etc., etc. So running around with just like super casual, like a few units, not great in the late game, but in the early game, it's something you can get away with. The other thing as we switch to the late game is big squads of units like this. Like when I look at this army, I think, holy shit, look how many troops he has brought that do not have any mage support to speak of. Right? Like all I have to do is have stuff to deal with Firestorm, and then I can kill this stack. Right? Because that's all it is like a Firestorm stack. And it's a lot of guys that can deal with Firestorm, and then that's it. So, you know, you can do like a Firestorm trap or something with way fewer units. So, you know, when you get, you know, like if you're in a higher skill game, you start moving around big squads of like just units like this, and players are going to look like actively seek out to efficiently kill it. So not only is this not enough mages for multiple armies, this is not enough mages for a single army. So just adding that in there. Winter times when Doomstacking is really good. The other thing to talk about with that is how your units are going to move around on the battlefield. For example, if it's just going to be like front lines engaging each other, then a lot of times most of your units are going to be sitting there waiting, right? And by waiting, I mean, you know, waiting to catch an evocation or an arrow or something like that. And, you know, it's nice to have some kind of layers of defense in combat, not just have one line. But, you know, ideally, well, your units are all capable of dying while they're sitting on the battlefield. But dying isn't really what they're there for. They're there to kill stuff, right? So the more surface, like being able to just make a line across the battlefield of really high quality frontline units is like a major kind of point when you're thinking about army composition. And usually, in my opinion, you want the killy units, the guys who are going to kill things, like these guys with the 17 damage weapons in the front, and these guys with low morale and no armor and stuff probably at the back. And like these guys probably at the back. We'll talk about kind of the purpose of chaff, which is what he's got up here at the front. There's a few purposes of chaff. One of the purposes of chaff is to catch evocation, which these guys will probably do pretty effectively. And so that can be kind of nice to have some chaff up here at the front just to kind of take a little bit of the load off your real front line. In my opinion, the most important purpose of chaff is to tear down fort walls. So that's why I normally, like if I only had this much chaff, I would probably want it in the back. And then they would fill in gaps in the front line, but they would also help tear down fort walls. They're not going to do a ton of damage in the front line proper. So anyway, yeah. Typically, in my opinion, to have, and if you watch my Saramatia series, I kind of do it there more than I think in other ones. But if you watch the Saramatia series, you can see I usually have like a front line of sacreds, and if you also in the tournament series, you can see I think Arco does this a fair amount too. Like typically front line of very high quality units, and then he'll have some kind of support and chaff stuff in the back. The other problem about bringing too much chaff, especially when you have high quality units, and putting the chaff in the front, is if they die, it'll make it much more easier for these guys to HP route. So anyway, that's just another thing to be concerned about. Yeah, so Chaff is good. Oftentimes you want it in the back. If you have a lot of it, you can put some as evocation bait out in the front. You typically want to have a high front, like a very killy front line that, ideally you're buffing up. And what next? The other thing, of course, is the mages. And here we don't have many mages. But, like, if you look, these are the armies I'm rolling out at the time with. Like, look how many mages I've got, guys. It's a lot of mages, right? Here, I think I just got Flames from the Sky. But anyway, most of my armies are pretty high commitment in terms of mages. I don't really know what I've got running around. Well, this is not very high commitment for mages. But this is fighting Lemuria, and this actually is still pretty good against Lemuria. Anyway. Yeah, so imagine like just super generic formation. You've got now this many mages. The formation you're going to want to have on them. Okay, this is a mess. And sometimes a mess is okay, guys. Everything doesn't have to be that organized. It's kind of like you go and walk out in nature and you see things growing all over the place. A lot of times that's okay. What I typically like to do, and you can see I'm not really doing it here very well. Really, I'm just trying to knock through this fort and hit them with crossbows and skelly spam and, an astral communion here. But this actually is better to start with for just talking about a base formation. So I would say like general Doomstack formation. You have a line of high quality units in the front, maybe some evocation bait in front of that. You have chaff behind it, and then you have a big mage core. And oftentimes you want to have a few people on guard commander to kind of, buff out your mage core so that if there's howl, if somebody puts howl up, if there's flying critters and they jump in the back, then your mages aren't instantly going to die. Or if there's somebody that is able to get a flank off, your mages have some protection. That would be, I would say, the most general kind of formation for running around in Dominions. Oftentimes you'll have some mages that you want closer to the front to do buffs on your frontline units, and that's perfectly okay. And then if you have summoners, like summoning elementals, you may have those positioned out in the front somewhere so that the elementals kind of go in front of your army rather than behind them. Those are all things to kind of think about. The other important thing, because again, talking about like how many units do we want in an army, a lot of times you're going to get the most value out of just being able to, like, how many super high quality units do you want? Enough to make one solid front line, right? There are exceptions to this, and this is when you're going to be able to fly. So if you're a flying nation, you have flying units. A lot of times it makes sense to bring more. Or if you can cast mass flight, you can get a lot more bang for your buck out of more units. The exception to that, of course, is if you're defending against flyers, you don't want to have your units in a big long line like this. You want to have them clustered up in a ball, unless you have more units, right? If I know I'm going to outnumber somebody and they're going to fly into me, a lot of times you can do double line, which is a formation I like a lot against flyers. A lot of double lines, and you make a lot of space for the flyers to land all around you. And then your guys will usually tear them up if you have an advantage number. But normally when you're fighting flyers, you don't have an advantage number. And that's because flyers, they're just able to run around the map and consolidate or concentrate forces much faster and stronger than a normal nation can. So that's, I would say, the basic part of army composition and like where you put troops. Normally something like this, chaff in the back, mages in the middle, with some fluffers maybe closer to your front line and some summoners in front. And then all that changes if you're doing, if you're expecting to fight flyers. And usually you want some guys on guard commander. That's like super generic though. And there's a lot of exceptions or other times when you don't want that. There's other times when just generally you wouldn't want it. Like if you're going to be able to buff your front line with a lot of area of effect stuff like Wooden Warriors or something, It can be better to group them up into block formation so that you're more efficient at buffing than to have them in this line formation. And you split them out into several boxes. So that's totally another thing you can do. So anyway, this is all like very vague kind of general advice for army formation. The other super important thing is, of course, buffing your armies. And here I'm not talking about like the point buffing or the area of effect buffing. I'm talking about the battlefield-wide buffing. And that's super important. And especially as the game goes later, you may be able to have enough troops to put out like 2 or 3 armies. But if you're only able to get, like, let's say you're able to get mass protection and mass regen off, right? And you could do that on like up to 6 armies. But you have a bunch of mages that you've had to summon. They're not really common to your nation that are putting up other spells. You only have enough of those for 1 army. What that means is if you split up your army and you have like 1 main force, but then you have like another secondary force, which is smaller, but is only doing mass protection, mass regen, then the smaller army will get crushed by a similar sized or even smaller army from the opponent that has all the buffs on it. So a lot of times, your ability to field armies in the late game, or in the late mid-game, is going to be determined by how many armies you can efficiently buff. And not by like 1 or 2, but by like all the things that you think you're going to need to win that fight. Like, what are all the big enchantments you need to have up to win that fight? So that's important. And if you violate that rule, which of course you can say, well, I'm going to split off because I think I'm just going to do mass protection, mass regen on this 1 army instead of everything. It can pay off, but you're really running the risk of having basically somebody jump on top of that smaller army and completely kill it. And your troops are, of course, like how valuable each troop is, or like how much mileage you're going to get out of each troop, is going to be based on how many buffs are on them. So if your opponent is able to take fights against your troops where there's not a lot of buffs on them, then they're going to trade really well against you, is what I'm trying to say. So I think that's mostly it. I haven't covered, and I'm not planning on covering, all the different army spells that you want to put up. But basically, all the battlefield-wide enchantments. Ideally, you have on your armies in the late game. Though, of course, that is hard to do always. And it's expensive to do. It costs a lot of gems every battle to do that. But I think that's it. The thing I want to add, though, is it's easy to kind of listen, I think, to what I just said and say, okay, well, I always need to Doomstack. And a lot of times that's not true, right? A lot of times you don't need to Doomstack. Like, especially if you're not really at risk of having your opponent run into you and, like, hit you with everything, then you don't want to. It's better to split up in raids. So knowing when to split up in raids is important. And I think the other thing, too, is don't be too greedy with your mages. A lot of times, especially in the mid-game, you've researched enough of your core tech. And the incremental gains you're going to get from a bit more research oftentimes are less and less as you go farther and farther in the game. Like, especially once you get your first level 9, it's like, okay, like, get some of the mages out of the lab, right? And a lot of times, like, the greedy play is, well, I've got these armies, I need to send them out and use them. But I've got all these mages in the lab, and then your army runs off and dies because you go off and attack somebody who has a ton of mage support because you're running into their land, you're close to their castles, etc. You lose your army, and then you come back and you have to fight them, and now you have no army because your army's dead. But you've got a ton of mages, but now your mages are fighting without troops. So, short summary of that is don't be too greedy. Know when you have enough tech to make a move, and when it's time to make a move, bring enough mages to support the number of armies you need to field. So anyway, quick video for today. Anyway, hope y'all enjoy. Take care.